You are listening to We Saw the Devil, an investigative and conversational true crime podcast that deep dives into fascinating criminal cases that are solved, unsolved, or ongoing. From America's Lori Vallow to Germany's Armin Meiwes, we examine and discuss the world's most shocking cases. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow us online. Check us out at WeSawTheDevil.com and We Saw the Devil on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, you can become part of the show by backing us on Patreon. Hello everyone, you are listening to We Saw the Devil. This is Robin, and I am very excited to present today's episode to you guys. As you know, we've been covering the Gabby Petito case basically since the beginning, and it has significantly impacted us emotionally. I know that the entire world has been on the edge of its seat following this for a variety of reasons, which we covered also in the previous episodes, but we wanted to view it from a different angle. The purpose of today's episode is to dissect the chest cam footage, statements by Gabby Petito's family and friends, from the angle of domestic violence. There's been a great deal of criticism, not only for this podcast for covering this case, but on a national level as well. Missing white woman syndrome is a phrase that many of you may have picked up on in the national media lately. I posted a few articles on our Facebook page, which caused a bit of controversy too about the racial disparity in coverage of missing women cases in the media. This case has sparked so many different conversations, and one of those is shining a light back on domestic violence. And we believe here that Gabby's death has captured the nation, the world really, partially because of the statistic that she was part of. And that statistic is that 1 in 4 women experience severe physical violence from their partner. That's where Brooke Linville comes in. Brooke is an amazing human being, and we are so incredibly lucky to have hosted her on this show. She gave us way more of her time than probably deserved, but she is a published author. She is a TED Talk speaker and just all around amazing person. We really wanted to hear from someone who has lived through domestic violence and advocates for other survivors by sharing their story. And that's where Brooke is coming in, and she's going to assist us in breaking all of this down, have that discussion of what we can do better as a society, as a country. Where do we go from here? What are warning signs? How can we help? A lot of us sit here and it's just like we see cases like Gabby Petito and we feel helpless. We want to help. So that's what this entire episode is about. Before we get into it, let's just get some quick housekeeping out of the way. You can find us at WeSawTheDevil.com. From there, you can find all of our social media handles. You can send us an email, submit a case request. You can also find our Patreon. That's patreon.com/WeSawTheDevil, where you can financially back the show in exchange for some cool benefits. And if you have just 10 seconds of free time, please hit that subscribe button and leave a 5-star review. It would mean the absolute world to us and actually has a lot to do on the administrative side of podcasting. So you can help us out that way too. And for today's guest, Brooke Linville, you can head over to BrookeLinville.com. That's BrookeLinville.com. And from there, you can find her social media channels as well as her TED Talk. I will also be posting all of Brooke's links into our socials for this episode, as well as our show notes and YouTube notes. So please check Brooke out. She's absolutely incredible author, speaker, TED Talk speaker, and we could not have been more lucky to have had her come on the show to discuss this topic with us. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into it.
Over the weekend, the Petito family held Gabby's memorial service, and at the service, Gabby Petito's father gave 2 pieces of advice that he wanted to share with everyone. The first was, if there is a trip you want to take, do it now while you have the time. And 2, if there's a relationship that might not be the best for you, leave it now. It's obvious that Gabby's death has captured the nation, and I believe this is partially due to the statistic that she was part of. 1 in 4 women experience severe physical violence from their partner. 1 in 4. Most of the time, the abuse, the violence, it goes unreported. injuries go without medical care, and there's a lifelong impact of emotional trauma that they have to carry. And every single time that abusers get away with it, they become more emboldened. And today we're going to be hearing from someone who's lived through domestic violence and advocates for other survivors by sharing her story. We have Brooke Linville here with us today. She's a writer, a speaker, and we're so excited to have her here with us to shed some light on a topic that we don't really discuss that often.
Hi, thanks for having me on today. Again, my name is Brooke Linville. I am a single mom to 2 kids that are fantastic. I am a writer and a speaker. I gave a TEDx talk in Boise a few years ago about helping to save my small women's college from closing by raising $12.5 million, which was really incredible.
In a short amount of time, nonetheless.
Yes, in just a few months. And it's up and running still. It's doing fantastic, and we're really proud of it. And I am a survivor of domestic violence. I write and talk about my experiences. My family law case recently was finalized, and my kids were finally able to get free of abuse as well. And so it's freed me up to be more vocal and advocate stronger for the things that I think we can do better to protect women and children and anybody who finds themselves in a domestic violence situation.
That's incredible. And we're so glad to have you here because, one, I think it's one of the things we don't talk about domestic violence enough. There's such a stigma related to it. And we feel that your insight on this could be really helpful, not just for understanding Brian and Gabby's relationship a little bit better and what could have been done differently, but then also hopefully anyone who's listening right now, this is something that can help you too. So we're really hoping that this can be something that educates and helps remove that stigma at least a little bit. So Brooke, at what point did the case of Gabby Petito cross your radar?
I think I spent enough time on Twitter. I'm sure I saw a tweet about her missing. I can't speak to exactly the moment that I started watching it. But I know that my interest and my desire to learn more about it intensified when I saw that there had been a domestic violence stop prior to her going missing, and that they had considered charging her with domestic violence. I think at this point, even if you haven't seen the body cam footage, you've probably seen the photo of her looking distraught in the truck. And I think that image did not square with the narrative of her as an aggressor. And so anytime that 2 things feel discordant or not lining up for me, particularly after what I've experienced, that's when I become curious about what's really going on.
And I think this case has just caused such sensationalism in the media and on social media. A lot of people have just become so invested, myself included, for a variety of different reasons, I would say. And I think true crime especially is followed by women in particular, because we often recognize part of ourselves in the victim in many cases in the news. So I know my personal reasons, but in what ways did you yourself identify with Gabby when you first saw the headlines?
I think it is. I do. I think the reason that we're interested in it is that we do see some of our own selves reflected back. And that's certainly how I felt with this case. And one of the reasons why I have become so invested sort of in the story and how this happened. I see myself as the quote unquote crazy girlfriend or the crazy wife, and now the crazy ex-wife. That's a narrative that we hear too much about, how a woman is spiraling out of control or having a mental health breakdown. I think that was the term that I heard very early on in the case, was that she was having a mental health crisis. And that really kind of made me stand up, because that's what happens in psychologically abusive, in particular relationships, is that an abuser drives you to a place where you you are having a mental health crisis, but you're having a mental health crisis because your brain is trying to figure out how to keep you safe. And it can't keep you safe while you continue to pretend that nothing is wrong in the relationship. But you almost have to pretend that there's nothing wrong in the relationship, or you'd have to do something, and doing something is scary. The statistics show that it's scary. It's a scary time to leave. And it's just, it upends your whole life. And for Gabby to be on a road trip away from, her entire support system would be particularly dangerous. So, I think we don't talk enough about how domestic violence, how psychological abuse impacts the brain of the victim, and how that behavior can look suspicious to an onlooker if they aren't trained in domestic violence.
And this will absolutely tie into a conversation that we would like to have momentarily regarding police response and involvement with this, and particularly in this case as well, but with victims of domestic violence. But Brooke, I'm really curious, why do you think that women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence statistically?
I mean, historically, I think that when we look at who's had power in our collective consciousness over centuries, that's been men. And so as the power dynamics have shifted, that certainly has set up, I think that perhaps men, and I don't have statistics to back this up, but perhaps there's some backlash to that. But I think that what's maybe more important, we use stories all the time. As a storyteller myself, we use stories all the time to navigate through the world. For however long humans have existed, stories have been used as the mechanism for teaching. And if you look at our society, who gets to tell stories and whose stories are amplified? I think that the stories that are most often told to millions of people at a time are the ones coming out of Hollywood. And if the last decade has been any indication, perhaps the men in charge in Hollywood aren't the healthiest individuals to be the ones who are in charge of what stories get told. If you're a narcissistic man or an abusive man, or sociopathic man, sexual deviant, and you are in a position of power in Hollywood, and you're getting to fund stories and produce stories and sell stories, certainly behooves you to tell stories of women who are taught to be complacent to narcissistic men, or to, kind of find themselves doing the narcissistic dance.
So you're saying like romantic comedies, like, the example there. So what have we confused? Like, where did we get that wrong?
Well, not to just jumping in really quickly too. I mean, even if you go back and rewatch Disney movies, Disney princesses and whatnot, I mean, there are so many just toxic signs there too, in those films.
I have often said that I want to write a follow-up to Cinderella, because if you look at the Cinderella story, here is a young girl who has been scapegoated by an abusive family for her entire life. And some man comes along and falls in love with her in a weekend. If that isn't the classic, like, narcissistic setup, I don't know what is. And there's no way that Cinderella ends up living happily ever after. She ends up in a palace, likely in an abusive situation. One of my biggest red flags that I tell everyone is that love that happens too fast is not real. It's called love bombing in the narcissistic literature. We heavily romanticize this idea of people falling in love quickly and there being nobody else in the vortex of their lives, in that sort of whirlwind. And that's one of the biggest signs of an abusive relationship is one that happens very quickly, that doesn't give you time and distance to think through your feelings and for things to develop. And I think that it's contributed to us confusing intensity with love.
I could not agree more. And then also to your point of Cinderella too, the savior kind of complex of promising to save someone from an abusive situation too. She was shackled in basically in an abusive household, and then he came along and wanted to save her. So love bombing, the saving. Ariel too, my little mermaid.
Yes.
Isolating her away from her support system and family. Beauty and the Beast, I mean, is probably like one of the biggest ones. Like, I could go on, and I just feel so terrible too. Like, looking back as an adult, a lot of these films I loved, they were my childhood, and then looking back, it's just like, wow, so many generations of little girls were taught to find their Prince Charming, which opens them up to the love bombing, that type of behavior, and overlooking so many different red flags.
Yeah. And even, I mean, I was watching a show just the other day. It involved, somebody trying to set some boundaries about a relationship. And the main character was, threatening to take off his clothes and run through New York if she didn't acquiesce. And, somehow we have decided that that's romantic when that's actually manipulation. People, even if they're funny threats, but people making threats to get you to give in isn't the sign of a healthy relationship.
Or even, and my final, I guess, point on this too is I just last night that guy, I believe in Central Park in New York, who called out a piano, and he's going to sit there, not eat, drink, or anything. He's going to play sad songs until his girlfriend takes him back. Like, go ahead, sir, you do that, and you can just die on that piano seat, because that is abuse. Like, that is abuse.
And we don't teach girls and women that you get to hold your no. So if it's a no once, it gets to remain a no if you want it to stay a no. And that, we label women as bitches if they have the audacity to hold space for their boundary, to continue to say no in the face of something that is seen by the world as some sort of romantic overture.
I couldn't have said it better. Yeah.
Now, also, it seemed like no one really knew the extent of abuse that Gabby was experiencing with Brian. Not her friends. Her friend Rose apparently had an inkling. No one from her family. They've spoken on that. Why do you think that is?
Oh, so many reasons. My mom, I know you're going to listen to this, and I love you dearly. My mother did not recognize what was going on. In fact, when I started at the very end of my relationship, my marriage, when I started kind of feeding her little tiny glimpses of what was going on, in an attempt to make sure I wasn't crazy, she said, I think maybe you're making this worse than it is because you just want to get a divorce. And that's not how she feels now. She knows the extent of what happened. But, if you're a master manipulator, you can con other people, not just the person you're romantically involved with. And I've seen, I think that kind of one of two stories plays out a lot in these situations. It's either that the abuser is able to pull in the family to also manipulate the family, or if the family is a threat, then the abuser labels the family members as problematic and severs the tie between the victim and the family.
So it's an extra dose of control that they're giving.
Yes, that they're either making the family members complicit, but the manipulator, the abuser, is pulling the strings in all of those relationships. And I think that, people, con men, manipulators, abusers, they are incredible at impression management. And so they know when to put the mask on. They know when they have to be on their game. They know when they need the right words. And so in front of family members, if they've pulled the family in to their, cycle or situation, instead of alienated them, that they are putting the mask on when they need it around those family members.
And I assume that can be part of the whirlwind that you were speaking about too. Can you tell us a little bit, what was the whirlwind like for you? You have this master manipulator that enters your life. What was that like?
I met my ex-husband through a family member, and within a couple of weeks, he had moved into my apartment and we were engaged. I had known him less than a month, and that isn't my personality typically, but it felt intense. It felt real. We bought a house quickly, got married, and then I had my older son. And every time, there were moments where things would feel out of control or unnecessarily chaotic, or something felt off. And I try to kind of listen to myself in those moments. And I always found myself apologizing afterwards for trying to find myself again. One of my most vivid memories is when I had sort of mustered the courage. I was gonna leave, and I got home. I said, I think that I'm done, and I think I'm going to leave the marriage. And within 15 minutes, he had turned the narrative to the point where I was begging him not to leave me. And in the moment, you just can't, something seems wrong about that, I guess. But in the moment, you can't, you're caught off guard and you're on an uneasy footing. And it's not until your perspective has sort of righted that you can start to detangle some of the ways that the manipulation worked over years. And I lasted 10 years. I mean, I unbelievably did the dance for 10 years, which is too long.
I'm so glad that you're out of that and that you're able to look at it now and see those signs and recognize them and hopefully help others do the same. Can you tell us a little bit more? What were some of those signs, those things that you would brush off as like, oh, that was off, or that was weird? What were some of those things that a little bit let you in on what this monster really was?
What were the red flags? So the intensity, I think, that's always, it's because that's the easiest to spot. The rushing into falling in love, the moving in together too quickly, the quickness of enmeshment in finances. I think that is because the more that an abusive person can get you to have your lives intertwined, the greater the cost it is for you to leave, the harder it is to leave. And so for me, it was, co-signing on a car loan really quickly. It was my parents helping pay for a medical procedure. I was pulling in other people also so that I felt guilty about, sort of the cost that they had also paid, whether they were actual financial costs or emotional costs. And then, for me also, anxiety. I became incredibly anxious. That goes back to the, having a mental health crisis when you're right with an abuser. I had, not that I wasn't somewhat inclined to anxiety prior to my relationship, but my anxiety sort of went to an entirely different level. I was having, especially at the end, I was having panic attacks in my sleep, which I think was because that was the only time that my brain would let me lose control. Right. And that's actually another one is control. People think controlling behavior looks one way, and it's not always overt. And abusers and manipulators are really good at maintaining control in insidious ways. Sometimes that is lack of responsibility or not doing the things that need to get done for day-to-day living. And so, they're maintaining this control by looking out of control, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. That if, they're the ones not paying the bills or stuff's getting late or they're leaving messes everywhere and they're sort of pulling the strings of this chaos. And people in victims in abusive relationships can often come across as potentially controlling themselves because in that trauma, they are doing things to try to get any sense of control in their lives. If, for example, if you look at if in the Gabby case, he was driving erratically and she pulls the wheel, that's an attempt to get some control to make it stop. And then that can be seen as the problematic behavior when the abuser is creating the chaos and the fear and the circumstances that leads the victim to need to take the behaviors to get the control.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the best ways that we've been able to somewhat analyze and understand domestic violence is seeing the entire police body cam scene unfold. We see a completely different Brian, right? We see this almost kind of bro, fist bumping the cops, jokes here and there, lots of smiles, and these kind of just sly comments about his, girlfriend that kept getting a little worked up. She's got anxiety. How she gets. And just, you watch this unfold in a completely different way when you're looking at it as that's the abuser. We see his ability and his comfort in speaking with police. We see some of what you'd said of, they kind of sit back and let the victim have to step in and take care of things. In the police body cam footage, he jokes about how, Gabby has to remind him to charge his phone. She has to remind him to find the charger, and she doesn't like having to clean up after the messes he makes. So you can actually hear bits of what you're talking about in just this short little interaction. The other thing that I found really fascinating was not just how many times Gabby said, "I'm sorry," when she was explaining and trying to explain what happened to the police officers. Brian said, "I'm sorry," probably more often than Gabby did, which is insane because I lost count after 20 times with Gabby. Did you ever notice yourself maybe mimicking behavior of your abuser as well and apologizing? Is that something that's kind of part of that as well?
I want to talk about that. I have a question for you first, though.
Sure.
In paying attention to the apologies, who is he apologizing to?
The police, every single time.
Yeah.
And who is she apologizing for?
Him.
And
herself, mostly herself. Like, I'm just anxious. I have OCD. I'm sorry. I'm stressed. I'm having a hard day.
Is he apologizing for his behavior or her behavior?
Oh man, I think it's always her behavior and then like the situation. He never apologizes for something he does. It's usually
almost like the inconvenience of the situation.
Right. He's not apologizing for existing the way that she probably is.
Correct.
I think that it's, if you are someone on the outside of a domestic violence situation, and maybe you are wondering if someone that you know and love is in a potentially abusive relationship, that paying attention to the apologies is a great way to get insight into the relationship. It's not going to tell you everything, but certainly if you are hearing somebody apologize for normal behaviors or constantly apologizing for just being, that can be a sign of somebody who is in a relationship where they are constantly trying to make things right. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is that line about the phone charger. It's interesting that that's the thing that my brain has sort of connected to, but that was a constant in our relationship, was that I was having to constantly remind my ex-husband to charge his phone, to the point that when our house burned down, when I was pregnant with my older son, my ex-husband's phone died while he was in our house. So our neighbor's house is on fire. There's fire trucks everywhere. You can't see through the smoke. And my ex-husband has gone in to get a couple of things, and his phone dies in the middle of us talking because he hasn't remembered to charge his phone. And the chaos that created for me, but created over time. If you can't be in contact, one of the things that was always interesting is that I always had to respond immediately to any text or phone call that came through. But if I needed or wanted to know where my ex-husband was, that I was seen as anxious or crazy or overbearing. It wasn't a two-way street. It was sort of, your anxiety is creating this space that you need to go deal with. But for me, if I didn't respond immediately, I was called a bitch, or he threatened to leave me, within 5 minutes of me not responding to a text message.
That's so scary, because there's this part in the police body cam footage where, Gabby's in the backseat of the police car, which that's, definitely not the place that she probably needed to be in that moment. But here she is worried about her own legal standing. What's going to happen to me? And she's telling the police, will you please get him that phone charger? He always forgets he needs this. And so I have to wonder if, similar to your experience, was she experiencing this almost underlying stress of, if he doesn't charge his phone, he can't talk to me, I'm going to have hell to pay too.
Yes, that there's some consequence for him not having his phone charged, or that she's to blame for his phone not being charged, as though he's not an adult.
And the other thing too, in the body cam footage, and this is the part that I don't understand entirely, so I'm hoping we get more details. Brian says he doesn't have a phone at all, yet there's this charger they keep mentioning. And he jokes with the police officers and goes, well, that's why I need her. Without her, I've got no way of getting in touch with anyone. And so his apparent lack of even having a phone makes her even more responsible for him as being his source of communication to anyone else.
It's really interesting. I think that our sort of cultural understanding of what abusers look like is this overlord, this strong guy who has this presence of authority. And the reality isn't like that at all. Certainly not in my case. It doesn't appear in this case that there are plenty of abusers who are irresponsible. Even if you look at the diagnostic criteria of sociopathy, irresponsibility is in there, sort of lack of ability to hold together your life. And in my case, I had an apartment. My ex-husband moved into my apartment. I had a house. He was dependent on me for the upkeep of having a place to live. And I was concerned if we broke up that he was going to end up living underneath a bridge. And I communicated that fear to our marriage counselor, who had to remind me that he was a grown-up and he was responsible for, figuring out his housing, which he has done with no problem. But he always made me feel like, if it wasn't for me, he'd even say this, if it wasn't for you, I'd probably be dead. And that's an incredible responsibility weight to put onto another person, somebody who he already knew was prone to feel guilty and responsible for others. But I think that irresponsibility is a cover, and it works. So, how can you possibly be an abusive, controlling man if you can't even figure out how to contact your family without this woman? In my custody case, it was sort of like, how could my ex-husband be abusive if he can't figure out how to get to a doctor's appointment? And I think that that's a complete misunderstanding. And I think that's a problem with our legal system, is that it really doesn't understand what control looks like, what insidious control looks like. We don't leave a lot of room for nuanced discussions. We want everything to be black and white, and it's just not. And I think that that's a place where we definitely need to have more conversation about what the profile of control can look like.
I'd love to hear you kind of translate and read between these lines in Gabby's initial statement to police and help us identify these signs of control and Brian's follow-up to it. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
Okay. So these are just some snippets of what Gabby rattled off fairly quickly to police. when they asked, what's going on? She says, I have really bad OCD. I was apologizing to him. I'm sorry I'm so mean. I get really frustrated. It's my vibe. I'm in a bad mood. I'm sorry I'm in a bad mood. I'm stressed. He doesn't believe that I can do any of this when talking about her blog. We've been fighting all morning. He wouldn't let me in the car. He told me I needed to calm down. I'm perfectly calm. He stresses me out. It's a rough morning.
What really sticks out to me there is he wouldn't let me in the car. It reminds me of the threats of abandonment that my ex-husband used to use for me, which was if when I helped save Sweetbriar, when we successfully won the legal challenge, I came back to the college to celebrate and to be with a group of people who had worked so hard to save it. And my ex-husband sent me a text message and said, or sent me a voicemail, one of the two, and said that he heard me laughing and that he was leaving me. He'd watched the kids till we got home, but he was divorcing me because he heard me laughing. And so my entire focus shifted in that moment to placating him, to convincing him that I wasn't laughing, which is a really strange thing in retrospect. But when I think about Gabby's story and the podcasting element, or the I guess not podcasting, the video blogging,
or
the travel blogging element, I see a lot of similarities in that with what I was dealing with, the Sweetbriar situation, and in how my successes became a threat to his control. I mean, obviously we're speculating here, but it's something that I react to when I hear her words. And he doesn't believe I can do it, that her potential success was a threat to his control. In order to maintain complete control over someone's life, in order to exert the kind of control you need to abuse somebody long-term, having influence over other people in any kind of external environment, or being liked by other people, is a threat to their domination, because they can't, if other people like you and think that you're a decent person, then it creates a conflicting narrative in your brain when they try to cut you down as a way to keep you in line and doing what they want you to do. And so I absolutely think that the podcast was a threat. And between the comment about he doesn't think I can do this, and then leaving her behind in that same story, that those two things are very, very connected and are a huge red flag to me, that something isn't right here.
And I would like to also kind of add some context to this too, because the original call that came in, one of the pieces that I would like to cover with you during this is law enforcement, what they can do better, how they reacted to this, get your thoughts on that. But I think it's worth noting too, that the original call came in and it was a report that a male, Brian, was going after Gabby, like walking after her and slapping her, hitting her, and then they got back into the van and sped off. So that original witness statement was that a man was slapping and hitting a female. So they got back into the van. The speed limit was just 15 miles per hour, but they're going 35 miles an hour and then hit the curb. Like, the police witnessed this. The officer pulled them over, and then that's when the exchange that Brittany just verbalized took place. So we've covered Gabby's original statement to police. Gabby's sitting in the back of the police SUV. She's distraught. I think a lot of us, for me personally, the still shot and just watching her sit distraught in the back of that police cruiser just absolutely wrecked me. As the officers are tending to her, one officer goes and begins chatting with Brian. And Brian is still in the driver's seat. They treat him completely differently. His first question to the officer was, "Did you talk to Gabby already?" And then finally, eventually, he was asked to step out of the van, which I find so interesting, the chronological order of events here, because he, in the original report that the dispatcher took, he was the aggressor, but he was allowed to stay in the van. He was allowed that extra moment, whereas she was almost treated like a perp right off the bat. Brian's conversation is she just gets worked up sometimes. I try and really distance myself from her. So I locked the car and walked away from her. She's trying to start up like a little website, blog and everything. We had a nice morning. She got worked up as we tried to get our day going. And then the officer immediately noticed scratches on his face. Brian continues, she had a cell phone in her hand. I was pushing her away. I had the keys. I said, let's calm down and take a breather. And then you notice in the video, his hand, he has a lot of hand movements and hand motions here.
And he talks so fast too. He talks so fast.
Yes, he does. He said, let's calm down, take a breather. She was getting worked up. She had her phone and she was trying to get the keys from me. I know I shouldn't push her, but she was trying to get the keys, so I pushed her away. She got me with her phone. And then the officer asked to see his hands. He had a scratch on his hands and he just completely dismisses it. But Brian said that it's from a wire. So the officer's like, hey, why'd you hit that curb? Brian said she grabbed the wheel and he asked Brian why, hey, you were driving. Why were you speeding? He said, didn't mean to, just shaken up, adrenaline, startled by the police. And then Gabby grabbed the wheel. And then that's when Brian pretty much launches into the apology tour 2021.
Yeah. So looking at this, Brooke, if you could help us understand what are some of those red flags that you see here as well?
Well, what I think is incredibly fascinating is that he admits to the police multiple times that he has pushed her away. So he has admitted to having hands on her at some point, right?
Yes.
And yet that wasn't something that they took into consideration, it doesn't seem. You know, and I think that that's something that a lot of us that have found ourselves in these situations feel is that even with an admission of guilt of some sort, that nothing seems to happen. So, you know, I don't even know that there are any red flags. He admits that something has happened, that he has put his hands on her, and yet he continues sort of talking through it. And so there's not enough time for anybody to pause and to think about what he's actually said. Mm-hmm. I think that happens a lot in these situations. That certainly happened in my situation, is that there'd be something that normally you might pause on or give reflection to, but the words just keep coming. And so it's just this like steamroll of information. And so your brain can't latch on to the part where he has just admitted to putting hands on her.
Yeah. You know, one thing too, I just want to reiterate just how fast Brian spoke. So fast. In fact, towards the end of his interview with multiple police officers, one of them even asked him if he was always so hyper, so anxious. Thinking about your own experience and your ex-husband, do you feel like was he a fast talker? Did he kind of come across as hyper as well?
Yes, but I would say that, it's called word salad sort of in the narcissistic literature, where there's a whole lot of talk altogether. And nothing sort of, it's rambly and nothing really makes sense, but it's just like this constant stream of information. It's like a deluge on your brain. And it's a strategy. And I don't think that it is unintentional, because I would venture to guess that he isn't a fast talker in every situation. It goes back to that conversation about they know when to put on the mask. And so they have an entire lifetime of information of what strategies work to get them out of trouble. And they pull on those in moments of need, and fast talking, saying nonsensical things, and admitting what has happened. I think that a lot of us, we all have sort of defense mechanisms. And if someone accuses us of doing something, we might go, no, we didn't do that, even if maybe we did. But that's sort of our first reaction. With my ex-husband and in other situations that I know of, a lot of times they don't admit to the worst of things. Like if the police had asked him something that he knew was going to get him immediately in trouble, he might not have admitted to that. But they admit to enough. You go, well, if they're admitting to this little thing and they're willing to tell you that they've done it, like they seem honest. And so my ex-husband, he told me like within the first few weeks of knowing him that he had gotten fired from a job for peeing in the parking lot of a hospital. The red flags weren't hidden. They're good enough that you excuse away really inappropriate behavior for reasons that I don't totally understand.
That's interesting, because also in this call, continuing on with this chest cam, it's Utah. It's really hot outside. It's the desert. So Brian asks to sit in the shade, and immediately they become like best buds. The officers like, hey, you know, I'll be your shade. And then they laugh. I mean, it's completely like they've been best friends for years, and you can see them in the background laughing and chatting and whatnot. Was your ex able to vibe immediately with law enforcement? Did he connect? Was he able to put on that mask?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a lot of, I kept my ex-husband out of a lot of trouble. But I, you know, there was certainly law enforcement involved afterwards. And it always sort of felt like everybody just bought his story. And so, no matter what I said or my kids said, it was sort of like, you know, women and this person who has a history. So I don't have a criminal record. And this person who does have a record of having interactions with police and having sort of antisocial behaviors is given the benefit of the doubt. One of the challenges, I think, with the legal system, one of the things that frustrates me with the legal system is that perpetrators, abusers are given the benefit of the doubt. The accused is given the benefit of the doubt, but victims are not. In my ex-husband's defense of any of the things that were said, he could launch any number of allegations against me, and that was seen as not the same. And I wasn't given the same opportunity to defend against those allegations or the insinuation that I was crazy or lying, where he was given every opportunity to prove his innocence. And I'd be curious to know whether or not that's completely gendered. I have the sense, based on some research, that is sort of a gendered response, that, you know, oh yeah, of course the woman must be lying.
And we pick up on that in this entire interaction on the police body cam. You can see that. And whether that's a systemic thing, maybe just something at that department, or if it is just straight up, this is how it is, it's wrong regardless. I want to go back to something you said, though, just a little bit ago. You said that you multiple times worked to keep your ex-husband out of trouble, right? A lot of the times you would protect him in a way. We can kind of see that here in this conversation between Gabby and police officers, where she's taking on blame, and they kind of feed into that a little bit. One of the questions the officer asks Gabby, it was really hard to hear, but he said, "Were you hitting him? Do you tend to have a lot of anxiety and stress? Is Brian usually pretty patient with you?" That, to me, shared a lot of bias that was there already that you're speaking about. But what would be going through the victim's mind in that instance when they recognize that the police are seeing them as the abuser, the one that's keeping the actual abuser out of trouble? What would that person be feeling?
I can speak to how I would have felt. And I, it's one thing to keep them out of trouble, sort of out of sight. And that's like, when at the end of my marriage, when my ex-husband was making threats towards my life or was engaging in some stalking behaviors, and I was encouraged to go to the police, I really struggled with that decision because I didn't want to get him in trouble, which is crazy. Someone's threatening your life and you don't want them to get in trouble. But that's sort of the worldview that you take on. And that's a very protective space. I think that probably had police come, if police had shown up in any of those instances and then somehow blamed me for the violence that was being inflicted, even if it's just emotional violence, I don't know that I would feel protective in that moment. I would just be distraught. I mean, and I think you see that in that situation and why don't you believe me? Like, I think there's some degree of self-protection too, that I'm not trying to cause problems here. And when the system, I know from my own experiences, not with law enforcement, but when the system treated me as though perhaps I was the contributing factor, when a judge or child protection or any of the people involved in the system acted like maybe it was all in my head, or maybe I was creating this situation, it made me less inclined to get help again. And each time that we subsequently asked for help was taking a gigantic risk, because the perpetrator's emboldened every time that you do it, and the consequences for you, if nothing happens, are greater.
Yeah. And going back to that of how she probably just felt defeated, like, why isn't someone listening to me? And then that self-preservation aspect. A lot of those questions that they were targeting her with were so accusatory. They were so accusatory. And in this one moment, Gabby admits that Brian did hit her first, right? She completely corroborates the witness statement and dispatch saying that a man was slapping a woman, right? Not the other way around. And when the officer actually asks her, okay, well, what happened? How many times did you hit him? Who hit first? When he hit you, and she cuts him off, she goes, it didn't hurt. He didn't slap. He was squeezing, but it didn't hurt. Was there an instance in your experience too, where you felt like you needed to walk back the truth a little bit? Is that self-preservation thing they're not listening to me anyways, what's the point? Is it that dynamic of trying to protect herself? Or is it the defeat of the police aren't listening anyways?
That's really an interesting question. I think part of it is, I think it's a combination. I think it's a nuanced situation. And I also think that certainly in my own experience is that there's this like incredible need to tell the truth in its like most intricate truthiness. And so in her mind, if it was like, well, it didn't hurt, or for me, if it was like, well, it wasn't a direct threat, you're trying to work it out in your own mind of what's actually happened, because your reality is so off kilter at that point. And you want to make sure that you're being accurate, and it's possible it didn't hurt. And so she wants them to know, like, it didn't hurt, so that maybe they'll believe me if I tell them every detail. And there's a sense of, if he gets in trouble, we're back together tomorrow, then what? Even if you aren't consciously aware of the abuse. And I think that for so many of us that have been through this, there is so much of the time where you are not consciously aware. I tell people I was in an abusive relationship for 10 years, and I only knew it was abusive for 3 months. That the psychology of an abuse victim is an incredibly interesting and sort of fascinating dive into the ways that our brains try to protect us. And I think that there is just this inability to accept what is really going on, because deep down in somewhere in your recesses of knowledge, you know that it's going to be worse if you tell them that he abused you and he ends up back in your van tomorrow.
That makes perfect sense. And I often wonder, watching this interaction, what was going through her mind, watching all of this unfold. I mean, the footage is over an hour long, which brings me to my next question. And this is actually the most, for me at least, one of the most reprehensible pieces of this entire interaction, is that there's a theme from this point forward of police almost assisting Brian in filling in the blanks. An officer interviewing Gabby actually says, "Do you tend to have a lot of anxiety and stress? Is Brian usually pretty patient with you?" The officer, and then he launches off into telling her and trying to relate with Gabby about his own ex-wife. I want to help you understand. We would feed off of each other's anxiety. I'm not telling you what to do with your life, but if you know you have anxiety, look at the situations you can get in. We aren't here to be mean to you. There's just a first time, and then another officer interrupts, and then immediately they're just interrogating her. They ask her if she grabbed the steering wheel. And Gabby said, "Well, I touched it, but I didn't grab it." And then immediately the officer walks back to Brian, and they're just laughing and having a great time, laughing and joking about random things. The officer says to Brian, "We see marks on you. She's got some on her too. We're trying to figure out what happened." And then they again ask Brian to repeat his story, which Brian at that point, same story. He said, quote, "The flies are bad, getting to Gabby. My feet are dirty. I moved the food around and it was disorganized and she got worked up. We had a little disagreement. I was dirty. We were at a coffee shop, earlier today, lots of little disagreements. It's just a lot of little things. I don't know if you're in a relationship, but," and then again, more bro stuff. The cop interjects and said, "I've been married for 5 years." And Brian continued, "Lots of little things. We weren't physical. Again, I said, let's take a breather. You go your way, I'll go mine. We'll take a break from one another and calm down." He said, "She had her phone and rings in her hand. I don't have a phone. So if she leaves, I'm on my own. I had the keys and she was trying to get them from me. I said, back up. And that's when she hit me. I wasn't overtly physical. I was just trying to keep her away from me. I got loud, like, back up, get away." And then that's when the officer said, "Okay, so you pushed her to create some distance. What about the scratches on your arm?" Brian said, "She was already swinging, man." The cops immediately jump in and they're supporting Brian. Okay. And Brian said, "I'm not complaining. I hope Gabby isn't complaining about me. I was just trying to be loud and create some distance." But yeah, I mean, that the entire theme is just the officers are trying to almost fill in the blanks with what Brian has told them. Original witness statements and Gabby's own statements be damned. Have you witnessed that in your line of work, your own personal experiences? Have you witnessed the police just come in, observe, and then just fill in with what they believe to be true?
So I think there's a couple things at play. I think, when we talked earlier about the stories that get told by Hollywood, if we have a problem with abusers and narcissists and sociopaths in positions of power in the media, what kinds of stories get told? I think that we have that same problem in law enforcement with domestic violence. If we, and the statistics bear this out, that there is a statistically significant enough percentage of the law enforcement community that also has a domestic violence history. And so if you are in law enforcement and you have a domestic violence history, whose side are you going to be on? Are you going to be on the side of the victim, or are you going to be on the side of the perpetrator, who is somebody that you identify with or see your own story in? I think that's, one of the reasons why this story resonated with so many women, as you said, is that they see pieces of their own stories in this. And so if you're the law enforcement officer who's responding to this and you have potentially a rocky or abusive relationship in your life, who are you identifying with? Not to say that that's the case here, but it's definitely something that needs to be talked about in our sort of collective discussions. And so I think that's part of the challenge. I had a situation where, after I had gotten divorced, was concerned about stalking, had a police officer out, and his response to me, I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything on my car and that I wasn't being tracked, just trying to do the best to stay safe. Again, didn't want to press charges, didn't want it to cause anybody any trouble, just wanted to protect myself. And the police officer did something similar with me, talking to me about his own story and about how, divorce situations get better over time. And I thought, well, we're talking about stalking here, sir. That's not a normal post-breakup situation. No. I'm not sure what you're telling me here, but hopefully you're not telling me that the stalking is supposed to somehow be a part of this divorce or any divorce.
I wonder why they feel the need to, interject their own stories into this, because I felt like it was so inappropriate for them to talk about it. And then hearing that you experienced the same thing, it just seems so inappropriate.
And also, I had that same experience with attorneys too, when we would try to talk to attorneys, that they would somehow relate their own, like something that was similar in their life. And it was like, well, that wasn't abusive in my life, so it can't be abusive in yours. And I was like, the circumstances aren't the same. And I think that's something that, going back to the importance of stories, that the stories that we tell and we hear matter. And it's important to know that our version of life isn't always the same as everybody else's, and not jumping to conclusion that your relationship, if you're a law enforcement officer, that your relationship mirrors the one that you are responding to.
There are a lot of, I would say, professions where relating to someone is definitely an option or a tactic or tool in their toolkit. But I think being a police officer is definitely not one of them, especially in situations like these.
No.
Even just approaching it with Occam's razor, right? Of why these two people are here, the witness statement, what's going on. The most likely thing to be true is probably, what's going on. The police asked about medication. And this is actually, this one almost made me vomit in my mouth a little bit, is they asked about medication. They asked Brian about medication, if he takes any, if Gabby takes any. And Brian joked and called Gabby crazy. He's like, yeah, she's crazy. And then, no, no, she doesn't take any medication that I'm aware of. But the trope, to me, it's really interesting in this particular situation, is that the trope of the hysterical woman, right, that's been around for freaking centuries at this point, is so still in play here in 2021 in this little situation here in Moab, Utah. She's made out to be just the hysterical woman. And then all of the police just kind of circle around it, bro, fist bumps, haha, my ex-wife was crazy too. Good luck to you. But finally, a female officer arrives on the scene, finally. And she actually goes up to Gabby. It shows Brian and the male cops, laughing and chatting in the background. But she actually joins up and discusses the situation. And she's like, hey, the original dispatch, what are the stories? Are the stories corroborated? The original male cop said, well, it's unclear if Brian was being defensive or aggressive. Brian locked Gabby out of the van, and Gabby actually climbed in through the driver's door over him. He said that their stories matched up. Brian said that she was a primary aggressor. And then, as we've already stated in this episode, Gabby too took the blame for all of it. But they did notice that the story doesn't match up regarding the steering wheel. The female cop says that Brian was probably lying to protect Gabby. Quote, "We can't treat this differently than if it was male to female violence. We have to charge her." And then the police actually apologized to Brian. One officer apologizes to Brian for all of this, and then again tells him about his own relationship problems. It's just absolutely crazy to me. And then they're trying to explain domestic violence to Gabby. She's standing there and they're trying to explain what domestic violence is and how she is the perpetrator and the aggressor in this entire situation.
I think that, that this is part of the reason why I think that this case in particular has gotten so much attention, is that this idea that this woman who was clearly abused and murdered, that she was seen as the abuser in this stop, when it's so clear that there is something else going on. And I think that it's a worthy discussion to talk about the ways that we have, the statistics bear out that women are more likely to be the victim. But we are so concerned with wanting to be fair that sometimes we don't look at the evidence that's right in front of us. And I think that's super frustrating, that they decided that, we can't treat this any differently than we would if it had been switched, but it was that way. And they were treating it based on the information that they had fed him, essentially. I think that abusers know that is possible, and they use that to their advantage. Like, oh, I just have to paint this person as the problem and get them to see that, like, I'm just being treated unfairly here.
Right. And, Brooke, that's kind of like the biggest question here. We all know what didn't go well. We can see where signs were missed, where things were handled incorrectly. So the big question is, what should have police done? What should they be doing differently so that we stop having this statistic of 1 in 4 women experience this, and most of the time it doesn't get reported? And to your point, part of that is because of how things get handled by police and generally just in the system altogether. How should this have gone down?
Well, I think that there's a quick reaction from a lot of people. I've seen it on Twitter. And anytime this stuff comes out, you hear this cry to, have social workers involved. And I want to caution that response. I have had social workers in and out of my life for the last several years. And I think that social workers have an incredible place in our mental health system. I also think that people who are drawn to that field tend to be incredibly optimistic helpers, which is a lovely character trait, but it's not helpful when you're dealing with a master manipulator. I watched my ex-husband manipulate numerous social workers over the course of time, and sort of get him on their side, because he was able to leverage their sort of naive optimism in the moment. He's very charming and knows what mask to put on. And if you're not trained in manipulative behaviors and on the lookout for manipulative behaviors, it's easy to get sucked into that vortex and into their charm. So I don't know that, a mental health social work team is the right response. Certainly, we wouldn't be talking about mental health as the response. If they had seen the male as the aggressor from the get-go, that sort of seems to be the response when it's a female who's distressed, which I think sort of goes back to that gendered responses to violence. I think that we absolutely have to have more training on domestic violence, but that's not enough. When we look at the percentage of domestic violence in law enforcement, that is a problem. And we need to have a serious reckoning with what is acceptable for our field officers. If you have domestic violence charges, are you an appropriate person to be responding to a domestic violence call?
Solid point.
And so I think that's a huge piece. Education isn't enough. If you want to have domestic violence teams, I think that's fantastic, but there really has to be a conversation about manipulation, that it's somebody who has to be trained in manipulative red flags, who isn't easily charmed by someone's victim story. I think that's a really important piece. I think that it's always better to err on the side of caution, that there's something going on that they just haven't. If you're called out on a domestic violence call, if there's been reports, third-party reports of victim slapping, if there's stuff here that we're not sure about, it seems prudent to treat it like a domestic violence situation and get both people into help, until you figure out what is true and real. And I think they tried this, but obviously unsuccessfully. One of the most important things is time and space. We talk about how these relationships start. They start intensely and quickly. And that's in part to not give your brain and body the opportunity to think through what's going on. So when we look at how to get out of these situations, how to be safe in these situations, the absolute best thing, and this was my marriage counselor's, she tried really hard, is to get you time and space apart, not a night, but real time and space apart, so that as a victim, you can start grounding yourself in your reality again, not in your abuser's reality.
I can see that would be an absolute necessity. And also, to your point, you've mentioned multiple times during this interview, coercive control. And I have a question for you too on that. And let's just start with laws, right? Because we live in the United States here, and each state has its own laws. First of all, there's no federal one, statute, one law to rule them all. Under Utah's law, where the Gabby Petito incident took place, if a police officer has probable cause to believe that domestic violence has occurred, the officer must make an arrest without a warrant or issue a citation. So in this case, Gabby admitted to the officers that she hit Brian. Other than the original witness statement, that Brian was slapping her,
he also admitted that he put his hands on her. He is talking about his own admissions.
They glossed completely over that entirely. Now, as the law views this, right, they did not make an arrest either way in this case. How do you better equip police from a state legislative level or approach to better handle calls like these? Because I've spoken with multiple women who said, my husband hit me. If I call the police, I'm going to jail too, and my life will be ruined. And so a lot of women don't call just because they don't want to be arrested as well, even if they did nothing wrong.
Yes. And I think so At the end of my marriage, my ex-husband was making veiled threats to my life, making me very uncomfortable and concerned that something was going to happen and that I was going to end up dead. Our marriage counselor, PhD psychologist, was also very concerned, sort of separately, that he was going to do something that was going to end with me dead. And so she had reached out to my personal counselor, encouraging me to create a safety plan, which did not get communicated. But when I told my own counselor what was going on, she counseled me not to go to the police. And I didn't have any of those reactive behaviors. Like there was no aggressive behavior in return, because she was concerned that the police would label me as crazy. So I think it's not just, oh, I'm afraid because I reacted. It's also because, you're afraid of how the police are going to view anything. Just existing is wrong. We have to have, there has to be something, women are concerned about going to the police, whether they're protecting their abuser, whether they're protecting themselves, whatever it is, they're afraid of going to the police. But it's not just that, it's that the laws aren't set up to handle domestic violence. They just aren't. Recently, my ex-husband was making some threats, has made threats to my kids over time, and the police were involved. And after the kids were interviewed, I was talking to the police officer and I said, well, when does it become enough? Like, when are you going to do something to protect them? And his response was, it's not enough for him to threaten them. He actually has to do something. And the reality is that the law, it isn't legal to threaten to kill someone. I would say in most jurisdictions, there's some sort of law against threatening to kill someone. Hopefully threatening to kill a child is against the law. And if it's not, it absolutely has to be. We have a very narrow understanding, even as the law tries to correct this, but we have a very narrow understanding of what domestic violence is, what controlling behaviors look like. And it's not, just hitting somebody isn't the abuse. And it's certainly not the most insidious kind of abuse. It's the emotional and psychological wear down over time that allows you to get to a point where the physical abuse occurs and you're not sure what to do, which is what I would suggest probably happened here, is that Gabby was worn down over time, emotionally and psychologically first, so that when the physical violence happens, you don't know how to respond. You respond, in a defensive posturing way as self-protection, and you're seen as problematic. I can't understand how you can walk around with a AR-15 and call that self-defense. But if you're being attacked by your partner and you slap back to get them off of you, somehow now you're the aggressor. Those two things don't square up for me. So I think when we look at the laws, that there have to be better written laws that are that clearly delineate what we consider domestic violence. But just writing the laws isn't enough. In our case, I am certain that making death threats is illegal. And yet the officer was like, the threats aren't enough. There has to be enforcement around domestic violence that we as a society demand. You as officers of the law, as people we have conferred with power to try to create some sort of order and peace in our society, have to take action when there is threats of violence, when there's psychological abuse. Yes, it's hard to prove, but we have laws, and just because it's hard doesn't mean that we don't do it.
No, absolutely. And laws actually are being changed. And something that you brought to light in kind of our pre-interview is, and we've mentioned it multiple times during this episode, is coercive control. And I've done a lot of research over the last couple of days on this. And I really appreciate you bringing this to my attention, because I don't keep up with UK law, right? That's not really in my purview typically. But something that is just mind-blowing to me is So in 2015, guys, England and Wales became the first two nations in the world to criminalize controlling behavior within relationships. They made coercive control punishable by up to 5 years in jail. And the UK police force actually did a study on this and determined that women make up 95% of those who experience coercive control, and 74% of perpetrators of coercive control are men. Brooke, would you mind discussing coercive control and what this is and what it looks like?
Yes. So coercive control is a much broader understanding of what control looks like. It's not the nagging woman telling you to charge your cell phone, right? It is a pattern of behavior that uses things like intimidation, death threats, even guilt tripping, any kind of psychologically manipulative behaviors to isolate and control and abuse another human being. It's a much broader understanding of what abuse looks like in terms of a sort of from a psychological perspective. And that's really important because abuse isn't just, hitting. It's this psychological piece, this emotional piece is the precursor and sort of the initial really damaging part of the abuse cycle. Coercion is not consent. Guilt is not consent. Threatening to abandon your partner in a national park is coercive and controlling. If you don't do what I demand, I'm going to leave you stranded in this national park with these wild animals. That is abuse. And if we as a society say that this isn't acceptable, we recognize that this is abuse. And I think that anybody would say that. Threatening to leave your partner in a national park with bears, if they don't follow your rules, is abusive. And so the question is, once we identify that's unacceptable, then what do we do about it?
Now, also, there's a great checklist, and I highly suggest, and I'm actually going to drop the link in our show notes and episode notes, because this is very important to recognize, guys. Coercive control is a pattern of behavior which seeks to take away freedom and sense of self. And the way that the UK and Wales have structured this is they call them bricks. All of these little pieces are bricks to basically a wall against one's freedom. So this includes manipulation, minimization, lies, excuses, stalking, surveillance, unwanted contact, extreme jealousy, possessiveness, unfounded accusations of infidelity, cruelty, threats, intimidation, unreasonable demands, public or private shaming, threatening to out your partner, ignoring their needs, punishing the children for infractions of your partner, denying access to money. I think that's another huge piece too of domestic violence, is especially when children are involved, or Brooke, you've even mentioned it earlier in your own personal experience, money, financial stability, sabotaging one's work, refusing to pay child support, forcing your partner to trade sex for things of value, controlling access to basic needs, destroying other relationships, isolation from friends and family. All of these bricks make up coercive control. And the UK and Wales have decided that, hey guys, this is toxic and should be illegal. And we're actually going to make this punishable by up to 5 years in prison, depending on the severity. Do you visualize an ideal system where this could potentially be put into place here in the United States as well? Like, do you agree with the system, Brooke, that they have kind of set up and recognizing all of these things?
Yes, I think this is a much more comprehensive perspective of abuse. I think that ours is too narrow. And I think that most people would look at those lists and go, oh yes, this is clearly abusive. And we don't think that people should be abused. Do I think that we can do this in the United States? I am not overly optimistic about our political system at this time. I think the fact that we can't even agree that women are equal and deserving of equal protection under the law with the Equal Rights Amendment doesn't necessarily bode well for this.
100% in finger snaps.
It's so hard to have, like, that's a very honest answer, and that's hard to hear, but fortunately there are still things we can do. There are still things that are available that do work. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things that do work right now if someone's experiencing abuse?
Yes. First of all, I want to say that if you are in a position of power to have influence at the local level and can help draft coercive control laws, that you absolutely should do that. I would love to see it enacted, at least in some jurisdictions in our country, the ones that can get it passed. If you are in an abusive relationship, there are lots of people who will help you get out, whether that's a women's shelter or highly qualified therapists. There are lots of books and resources that exist. The National Domestic Violence Hotline. Please do it with a safety plan and understand kind of what your steps are to freedom. Also know that there is hope and joy and laughter and love on the other side. And so do it safely and with support and help, because I want you to be able to have that joy and laughter and love on the other side. If you are someone who knows and loves another person who you believe is in an abusive relationship, just know that, one, they might know, but they might not know that they're in an abusive relationship, and they might not be open to hearing that information. And anybody who comes in that threatens the relationship, the abuser is going to want to isolate the victim from. And so you have to really tread carefully. The best thing is providing resources where they might identify themselves in someone else's story or see that there are red flags in their own relationship. One of the best things that I did for myself is that I started keeping notes on my phone that I had password protected. And I wrote down every interaction basically that I had over a month or so's time. And it was finally writing down what was happening that allowed me to stop pretending that it wasn't happening. And so keeping track and writing down what's happening and being honest about it is a huge step to breaking free.
Well, and of the gaslighting, I'm sure that not only a victim experiences firsthand, but then the one that they give themselves too. You know, I'm just making this out to be a bigger deal than it is. That documentation can serve not just to protect you later, but also protect you from gaslighting yourself and kind of, you know, not even being able to advocate for yourself because you're falling into that.
Absolutely. It's hard to deny reality when you've written it.
Yep. So documenting and knowing that there's resources out there, there's people out there that do want to help, but being safe about it. So in regards to documenting, be safe about it, have passwords, because as you've mentioned, Brooke, it's very common for abusers to have so much control that they do stalk. They do look to make sure that you're not looking for that escape. One of the things we noticed on the National Domestic Violence Hotline, there's actually a message up at the top that warns people your internet usage can be monitored. So here is how you can actually clear your browser history after you visited this website to get the phone number. Being careful and protecting that is, I think, of the utmost importance when you're already experiencing violence in your home.
Yes. And you know, there are ways around it. There's incognito mode. There is still clear, but there are ways to protect your browser history. A burner phone is something that I also had at the very end that just allows you to kind of have another communication point or a way to access information. The library is great. And the other thing that I would say is that before you get involved with an abuser, you know, just know the red flags. I think that one of the things that I would love to see is for us to start teaching healthy boundaries and red flags in sex ed courses in schools, because I think that the more, you know, manipulators are going to find a way if we all learn the red flags, they're going to figure out other ways. But knowing the red flags is a huge step in being able to protect yourself from manipulative and abusive partners.
I could not agree more with your suggestion of teaching these things in sex education. That's probably one of the most important places that you can learn about what's healthy and what's not, is when you're young and inexperienced and just trying to figure things out. That's when we should be learning these things.
And also remember that we are modeling behavior for our kids. And so if you need an incentive to get out of an abusive relationship, know that your kids are watching you, and that you can model another way for them.
Thank you for listening, guys. We hope that you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoyed having Brooke on. Again, we were so incredibly lucky for her to agree to do this and break all of this down with us. She's an incredible person. Again, brookelinville.com. All of her links will be available in both the show notes as well as on YouTube, and we will be tweeting them and putting them on our socials as well. But we really, really hope that if anything comes out of the Gabby Petito case, because it has opened up a conversation about so many different things as far as like racial disparity, domestic violence, and things like that, that if anything good can come out of it, maybe something can be changed, whether it's via laws, the way that media handles things, the way that police and law enforcement is trained to recognize situations like these. So much can change, but it definitely takes loud voices and a village and people willing to stand up to affect that change in order to do it. So again, a huge thank you to Brooke for taking the time to come on and discuss this with us. Once again, you can find us at WeSawTheDevil.com, where you can find all of our socials, patreon.com/WeSawTheDevil. So that is it for today, guys. Thank you again for listening. Once again, you can find us at WeSawTheDevil.com and find all of our socials as well as our Patreon. And I will see you guys next week. Until next crime.